Welcome everybody back here to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Manny Maradiaga, here on Tuesday, February 11th, halfway through the week pretty much, and we're still talking about the fallout, right, of the Super Bowl. We can't just have one day of talking about the results and everything like that, so on today's show, I thought I'd cover some of the more intriguing questions, really surrounding the Philadelphia Eagles mostly, talking about this potential dynasty that could be starting with the Eagles, why I feel like this could be the start of a long run here for the Eagles, not just a one-and-done season. Also, along that route, we're going to talk about Jalen Hurts. Is he now viewed as a much different quarterback after he won the Super Bowl? And not only that, but defeated Patrick Mahomes on his way to winning Super Bowl MVP? I think that's a valid question that we're going to get to on today's show, as well as some other rumors starting to swirl around free agency. So all those stuff coming up on today's show. But before we jump into our first segment, I want to remind you guys, if you have any questions or comments or any opinions you'd just like to share, please don't hesitate to do so. Your input and insight is always a great addition to the show, not on your mind, but also giving us and sharing your perspective on anything that we might not think of on our end of things. So if you want to make it absolutely sure that your message stands out, there's an easy way to do that just by using the Super Chat feature. Just click the $ at the bottom of the chat box to send in your Super Chat. In this way, it guarantees that your message gets on the air. I'm able to see it, I'll read it out loud, and I'll get you guys involved in the conversation. Again, it's a great way to support our channel, and we rely on your support to keep bringing you the sports content you love, and we appreciate every bit of it. So go ahead, let us know what you're thinking, hit the Super Chat button, and let's keep this show as interactive and as exciting as possible. Again, help us out a little bit, be involved in the show, get the conversation going, and click the $ at the bottom of the chat box to let us know what's on your mind. So now with that out of the way, we can start with our first segment talking about the Philadelphia Eagles. And, you know, Sunday's game, I do admit I thought that Kansas City was going to win. We talked about that yesterday. I even brought up a thought, right? Like, what would happen if the Chiefs were to win, right? I was thinking, and I sort of speculated, right? What would have stopped them from winning on Sunday and, you know, keeping the thing going, right? What would have stopped anybody from saying, well, why can't the Chiefs get 4 in a row, right? They got 3 in a row, why not 4? And then so on, right? Who would be able to stop them from keeping this dynasty going, essentially, was a question that I brought up hypothetically if the Chiefs were to win. And of course, I was wrong, but it was crazy. It is crazy now to think about how a very similar question still exists, right, with the Eagles now, right? What's stopping us from looking at this Eagles team and thinking, well, we're not talking about a three-peat or anything like that, but what's stopping us from thinking that this Eagles team can't be back here again next year, and then the year after that? And then before we get to the year after that, we will take a break and really look things over. But you know what I'm saying, right? Like, this Eagles team, the way that they won, especially over, you know, the reigning 2-time Super Bowl champs, and the way they just picked them apart and never really looked like they were panicked or anything like that. Rather, it looked like the Chiefs were the ones that had never been there before, and like they were tripping over themselves, creating a lot of mistakes, and they just looked overwhelmed. Whereas the Eagles were very calm, very methodical in the way that they did things, and their defense was just relentless all night long. So with the way this current Eagles team is built and the way that it looks like they're probably going to run the same group back again next year, the question is, right, are the Eagles now set up to be the next dynasty in the NFL, right? You know, recently one of the most consistent teams, you know, actually hanging around the rim, if you actually look at it, are the Philadelphia Eagles. Unlike other teams, right, the Eagles are actually constantly in the conversation of the playoffs, you know, at least a divisional round, other than, I guess, last year, right, where it went all downhill. But really in the last 8 years, I guess you could say, you know, it's their third Super Bowl appearance in the last 8 seasons, and it's their second championship in the last 8 years as well. And under Nick Sirianni and Jalen Hurts, in only 4 years together, they've already been to 2 Super Bowls in those 2 years, right? 1-1 in both of them. So, this is starting to look a little bit like the beginnings of something. And I'm not only saying that just because of the recent last 8 years, right? The last 8 years, only 4 of them were with Jalen Hurts and Nick Sirianni, right? But you can kind of see how this organization, really with their owner, Jeffrey Lurie, and their general manager, Howie Roseman, that they're constantly building and have built, I guess, this organization to be one of the most steady and competitive in the NFL for almost the last decade now. And now it feels like they've put all the right pieces together to this all-star looking team that, what's stopping anybody from getting in their way now? Because I always felt like you look at the Buffalo Bills, you look at the Ravens with Lamar, right? And they all look like great teams, great rosters, MVP level play. But until, you get over that last hurdle, until you can finally beat Patrick or get to your first Super Bowl, and then let alone win your first Super Bowl, it's always kind of hanging around the organization, right? Like it's always this dark cloud that until you finally accomplish something, it's never really going to go away. So now the Eagles have finally done it, and they've done it with this group, right? With Nick Sirianni and Jalen Hurts really leading this group. They finally got their first Super Bowl out of the way, and now I'm thinking, well, if they run it back exactly with this team and probably get better along some spots, right? Now they're going to be in a situation where it's not new to them. The lights, the media attention, and everything like that. They've already been there, and they've handled it very well, and they've already won their Super Bowl, right? So they don't have that pressure of not knowing what this week is like or accommodating to a bunch of media attention and stuff like that and getting out of their routines and all that sort of stuff that comes with the Super Bowl, right? They've already been through that, and they've known how to handle it. So I think that's always been a big thing when you're talking about, really good teams that are trying to be consistent, is until they finally do the final task, you don't really know, right? It doesn't completely wipe away all of your doubts. But now the Eagles have finally done that, and I would say I have more confidence in the Eagles to accomplish something that, maybe the Ravens haven't done yet, obviously, and the Bills, and even, I don't know, who else is always hanging around, like the Lions, I guess you could say, because, all those teams are very well built, and they're all looking like juggernauts, right? Juggernaut level performances and players, but when it gets to the big moment, AFC championship games, divisional games for the division and stuff like that, we've seen all of them kind of falter along the way. And I know no team is exactly, returning as the exact same team, right? That's what players always say. But, you still got guys like A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, that both of them just signed their extensions. Saquon Barkley is also locked in for at least the next 2 to 3 years. Jalen Hurts is only 26 years old, and you got a bunch of younger players, even younger than those guys, right? With Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, Cooper DeJean, Quinyon Mitchell, Nolan Smith, and Nakobe Dean, and an offensive line that's also not really going anywhere until at least for another 2 years, I would say. So that's kind of like the magnitude that we're dealing with, right? All these great players. You look at all those players that I just mentioned, almost all of them are the best at their spots. So with so many weapons that can harm you in many ways, that they've shown also that they're very adaptable, that they're not just based on one thing, and if you stop that one thing, then they're going to just crumble, right? We saw it in the Super Bowl, how it was mostly a passing game with Saquon not really having a typical Saquon kind of day. It's another reason why this dynasty, these early steps of a dynasty potentially that we're speculating here, could be in the works of being a lot more solidified going forward, because they're not just based on one thing, right? They can do a bunch of great things in each game, whatever's required, right? If they need to run the ball, they're very good at that with their offensive line, or like Jalen just showed, with a Super Bowl level performance, they're able to make a lot of key throws, really dominate the game with their passing game if it's necessary. So that's another reason why, you can kind of start inching towards this idea that the Eagles could be building something that's going to last for a good amount of time. And, Saquon even said it afterwards when he was talking to Pro Football Talk, when he said, why not start our dynasty now, right? Like, it feels like they also kind of have that mindset, right? I mean, I can only imagine what it feels like, right? But after you win a Super Bowl like that, especially blowing out a team by like 18 points, after the game's over, you probably feel like that was awesome. Like, you want to run it back again. And a lot of the teams, don't get the opportunity to do that with people moving on. But the biggest thing about this Eagles team, like I said already, is that a bunch of these guys are coming back. So, like, why can't they, right? I'm sure a bunch of them are thinking the same way. But, there are certain things that you can't control, right? It all seems great and awesome at this point, right? With the high of winning the Super Bowl. But you do have some things to consider, like injuries you could never predict, or Kellen Moore recently announcing that he is going to move on to coach the Saints now. So you got certain things like that, and some potential free agents that you'd have to re-sign. But really, for the most part, based on the question, I feel like I'm starting to look at this Eagles team like last year was really bad, obviously, with the switching of the coordinators and stuff like that, but it looks like they've got to an understanding of what they want to do with that going forward. You got to replace Kellen Moore, which is a huge thing, but the majority of the pieces are there. They know what works, they know what's successful for this team, and it's not something that's just like a one-off either, right? Like, sometimes you get into situations where all the stars align and you find yourself, benefiting off of it. But they are so dedicated to the run that you could just always rely on that. And then if it's not necessarily producing to the highest quality, you can always build off of that and incorporate play action and RPOs and stuff like that. So their style is not something that's just going to, die off and just kind of, simmer out, right? They're always going to be able to do that with that offensive line. So I'm feeling like this Eagles team, we're not calling any shots or anything like that right now, but they're built to last, right? They're very much entering their prime, so to say. So don't be surprised if the Eagles are just looking like the same sort of team next year, and we're talking about them and watching them play in the middle of January, right? So we're just saying it right now. It looks like the Eagles have done this thing as good as anybody could ever do it. So we're going to leave it there, just kind of exploring the realms of another potential dynasty, right? But we still got a long ways to go, and especially on this show, because we got to get to another segment when we return after the break. Sticking to the Eagles, right? We're not going too far off of them, but we're just going to hone it in on their quarterback, Jalen Hurts. Is he in a different sort of stratosphere now when we're talking about the best quarterbacks in the NFL? Has he now entered that conversation, and does he have a leg up over some of the quote-unquote best quarterbacks in the NFL? We're going to explore that question when we return after this break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit. A stupid myth, you choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
We are back here on the Chip Shot Football Podcast to continue to talk about the fallout from the Super Bowl a little bit, focusing more so on the Eagles, right, in today's show. And I see the questions coming in, so we will address some, or all of them, I'll say. Anthony, I don't think the Eagles are the next dynasty. I think that's still going to be the Chiefs. I think this is just an outlier. I mean, that's fair. I mean, who was it? The Patriots, right? Obviously, they won a couple, and they didn't get a three-peat, so they were still in the middle of their dynasty. So I can see that point. And I mean, the Chiefs are going to be there, right? So it's not like they're just done and the Eagles are now just going to take over that spot, right? They're still probably going to have to see the Chiefs, I would imagine, at least one more time in the next 2 to 3 years. So that point's fair. But also, Anthony says, I think he's still in the same area. He's a good or great quarterback that can give you playoff wins and Super Bowls, but I don't think he's in that stratosphere. I think Hurts needs to have everything perfect around him to win a Super Bowl, and I think that's what happened this season with the Eagles. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and that leads us perfectly into this segment, right? Because, the Eagles, especially Jalen Hurts, I feel like shut a lot of people up on Sunday, again, with a dominant Super Bowl win, and a win that saw him, get the Super Bowl MVP and stuff like that. And while most of this season is going to be predicated and, celebrated with Saquon in mind and the kind of historical season that he had, I think Jalen does get overlooked in a sense, right? Because I feel like he played some of the cleanest, most efficient football that most quarterbacks, or that I've seen really out of most quarterbacks this season. And Jalen Hurts, over the last few seasons, including this one, he's the only other player other than Tom Brady with at least 3 scores and a 70% completion percentage in multiple Super Bowls. Philadelphia is 43-13 in his starts since 2022, including playoffs, and he did throw an interception in the Super Bowl, which was his first turnover since November 10th versus the Dallas Cowboys. He finished this season with 32 total touchdowns and 5 interceptions this year. So, like I said, I mean, stuff that really won't show up, because the way that people, measure winning and measure success, it all kind of depends on what we're talking about when we're discussing, topics like this, right? Is Jalen Hurts now a top 5, top 4 quarterback potentially in the NFL? You can make a bunch of arguments. I would say, like, is he the most talented and maybe the most spectacular? Probably not. If, Patrick's going to be in there, obviously he's probably the overall one, definitely is. And then if you want to talk about spectacular and just natural ability, Lamar's probably up there ahead of Jalen. Josh obviously also can make an argument to be up there. So when you're talking about just talented and, just skill-based quarterbacks, that is something that probably you can make a solid argument for those other guys, right? But when you're measuring winning, right, and that it seems like the ring-chasing culture, I guess you could say, and how people usually measure success is with championships, right? And Jalen now has that over most of those other guys, right? In his 4 seasons as a starter, he's already been to 2 Super Bowls, and he's won one already, something that guys like Lamar and Josh Allen can't say the same. And even Joe Burrow, right? He's made it to the Super Bowl, but he hasn't actually won one, and he's only been to 1 thus far, whereas Jalen, 50% of his career, he's made it to the Super Bowl, right? So that's also something that you can take into account when you're measuring it based on success, on wins, and on Super Bowls, obviously, right? Was Tom Brady the most talented, most skill-based, just natural ability? Probably not. A lot of people would probably say like Rodgers or, a bunch of other guys ahead of Tom, but was he the most successful? And he's obviously viewed as the GOAT. I'm not saying Jalen's going to get to that status or anything like that, but, when we're talking about success and the quarterbacks that you really remember and hold to the highest esteem, I think you got to now look at Jalen a little bit differently, right? Because he was able to, yes, bring this all-star, perfect to some extent level team to the Super Bowl. But I think that with how important the quarterback is and how vital that position really is, right? If say right, you got a perfect team. Like the Minnesota Vikings, I think is a great example, right? They had almost a perfect team, right? When you look at Justin Jefferson, Aaron Jones, pretty decent O-line, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, a defense that was playing pretty well throughout the majority of the season, but the quarterback just decides to drop a goose egg in some of the most important games. You can see how that really just turns everything into dust very quickly, right? With Sam, it's hard not to put a lot of the blame on him, and it's hard for someone like me, I guess, to not directly look at Sam as the main culprit, right? Because everything else seems to be everything a quarterback could ask for, right? And the only difference this year seems to be that quarterback position. So for Sam to kind of dwindle down in those moments, you can see how if the quarterback still isn't holding up his end of the bargain, very talented teams like the Vikings can crumble just like that and look like they don't even belong in the playoffs, right? The Lions are another team, right, with Jared Goff throwing a couple interceptions, and they don't necessarily get blown out like the Chiefs did, but they gave up a whole lot more points than anybody could have given the Commanders credit for as the number one seed as well. So I feel like kind of selling Jalen short on that end just because the rest of his team is great, right? And they're built very like perfect, right? It seems like I don't think that should be so much of a knock on Jalen, because if he was actually like a really sorry quarterback and he just was obviously being carried by this team, I think it would definitely show and be exposed to some extent, right, at some point during the playoffs. But I think enhancing everybody else and keeping this thing going and, game managing the situation in a lot of these games, I think that holds a lot of merit. And they found their way all the way to the Super Bowl and ended up winning it in the end over a team where they have a better quarterback, right? A lot of people, and I would agree that Patrick is the better quarterback, but on the stage yesterday and to some extent in their first meeting in the Super Bowl, a lot of people will say that Jalen outplayed Patrick both times. But obviously Patrick won the first Super Bowl, and that's something everybody remembers. And now this time, Jalen outplayed him, and he also won the Super Bowl and got himself an MVP. So I think by that standard and by that, measuring stick, you got to look at Jalen a little bit differently. Because now, I mentioned he's made it to two Super Bowls in his 4 seasons, and not including Patrick, but the other quarterbacks don't have that efficient of a winning rate when it comes to some of the biggest moments in the playoffs and when you're really coming down towards the end of the season, right? Joe Burrow has been to a Super Bowl, like I mentioned before. He's also beaten Patrick on the road as well, right? It's only Joe, Jalen now, and Tom that have beaten Patrick in the playoffs. And you look at the other guys, not to diminish them either, but Lamar has 2 MVPs, which is a fantastic thing to do. He probably could have had 3 already, but it went to Josh. And with those 2 MVPs, he also has a 3-5 playoff record, right? So that's not a positive thing to kind of boast about. And he's only been to 1 conference championship, and he has no wins against the Kansas City Chiefs in the playoffs. So that also kind of hangs over your head, right? You keep running into the same person, the same opponent, and you just can't get it done. And the same thing, the same thing can be said about Josh Allen, right? He just won his MVP, well-deserved. He carried his team this season in a season where a lot of people felt that they were going to regress and not even be close to what they were, and they made it back to the conference championship, not only defeating Lamar and the Bills, but having a remarkable season. He had a lot of remarkable moments, a lot of remarkable games that we'll remember this season. But he's 0-4 against Patrick in the playoffs, right? And he's got no Super Bowl appearances. So, yes, again, those quarterbacks have a lot to be celebrated on, right? And when you're comparing them, it's hard to split hairs here, obviously. But I think with Jalen holding what is looked at as the ultimate prize and the ultimate, end goal, I think he's kind of... Would I put him ahead of all those other guys? Maybe not. Or maybe I might put him ahead of... it's so hard to say. I don't want to like just say something outlandish, right? I would put him in the same conversation as Josh, I would say. Him and Josh are very similar. Would any of these quarterbacks in this similar scenario as Jalen is right now, is Lamar on the Eagles and does he still have no Super Bowls? Probably not, right? He might have at least one by now, right? And Josh, is he having a Super Bowl with this Eagles team if he had this kind of roster? Potentially, right? I mean, you look at Jalen and he doesn't have to get through Patrick Mahomes each and every season, right? That's a huge thing to talk about, right? And the defense this year also played out of their minds, but also to kind of still back up my point, just to provide those opposing views, I think Jalen, for the kind of narrative that has been made of him and how the passing game, and a lot of people doubted the passing game, how they just never felt Jalen could kind of rise to the occasion when it was called upon. You know, this Kansas City Chiefs defense was a very good unit all throughout this year, and Jalen and that offensive line, you know, played them very well, and Jalen made a lot of great throws, a lot of great plays with his legs, right? He never really got into a spot where he looked panicked or anything like that, other than that one interception. Everything else from him was flawless. And does he benefit, you know, again, from playing in the NFC and stuff like that, and not having to play the Chiefs a bunch of times, like I said before? Yes, that is a huge thing, right? Because in the NFC, there's no Patrick, there's no Lamar, right? That's obviously a huge thing. But overall, I think Jalen, to actually go and do it, right? It always seems easy when you just mention and talk about it, right? But to actually go out there and beat the closest thing that people have seen to Tom Brady and this Chiefs team that was chasing history, that definitely holds a lot of merit from my point of view. So I would probably include him now as I would say like as a top 4 quarterback, right? It's hard for me to put him over Patrick, obviously. And I mean, I'm thinking about it now. I mean, is Joe a better passer, has more ability potentially than Jalen? Yes, but has he been able to get to the Super Bowl, right? And has this team been able to win those big games, right? A lot of people would say no, and I think I'm inching towards that. So I think Jalen has now entered in a conversation where you can mention him with Joe, with Josh, and maybe not Lamar to an extent, just because Lamar is something different that we really haven't seen too much of. But I think you can start including him with Joe and Jalen and Josh a little bit more, especially, you know, like we just talked about in the last segment. If they come back and do it again, right, there's really no choice but to kind of even boost him up a little bit more. But that's still a long ways away, right? But I think Jalen should be getting a lot of credit. He played an exceptional game, and you know that it's a very subjective topic, right? But from what I saw yesterday, where you know Jalen could have easily been rattled in such a big moment like that, dealing with the pressure of having this second opportunity, he was calm, cool, and collected as he always is, and he got the job done. So I think I look at Jalen a little bit differently now than I did on Saturday, definitely. But that's just my point of view. We still got a long time to go. He's still only 26, so we'll see where he ends up in a couple years. But for right now, we're going to move on and start talking about some free agency talk, some off-season discussions, one of the best times of the years, I would say. So our first topic on that subject is in the wide receiver market, looking at Davante Adams. It looks like, according to some reports, Davante Adams is intrigued about the opportunity of going back out west and joining a team out west, leaving the New York Jets potentially this offseason and joining another new team this upcoming season. So we'll discuss who those teams are and the best fit potentially for Davante Adams when we return after this break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Jumping back into the conversation now, looking at our free agency portion of today's show, right? Shifting our focus now a little bit past the Super Bowl, right? Where we're probably still going to have some discussions on it, but still also looking a little bit forward to what's next, right? Because the NFL season and the whole entirety of the NFL schedule doesn't really stop, right? You know, free agency will be here before you know it, and then you're talking about all the latest big signings and things like that, and you know, it just moves in an instant. So with that in mind, you know, with Davante Adams now in our focus, and with his time in New York seemingly coming to an end, it would also be logical that we start talking about some potential new destinations for Davante Adams, because connected to his future is Aaron Rodgers' future, and we already know pretty much that the Jets have told Aaron that they're planning on moving on from him. So with that, it leads us back to Davante Adams, right? With the whole premise of Davante Adams being in New York mainly was because Aaron and Davante wanted to play together again, you know, right? Going back to their Green Bay days and the great connection and relationship that they have, right? It felt like Aaron wanted Davante there, and Davante's time in Las Vegas was coming to a very stressful end, right? With the poor form that they were on. And if you saw the Receiver series on Netflix, you saw how down Davante Adams got at some point in that series. So a move was becoming more inevitable, and he ended up going to New York, and still it wasn't enough to save the Jets season. Obviously, the entire thing was a disaster. So now with Aaron essentially moving on, right, it feels like Davante Adams doesn't really have a place there anymore, right? Because he went there to play with Aaron. So I believe Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji really just also want to build and make this team a lot in their likeness. And not to say that Davante Adams doesn't 100%, you know, fit into what they want to do, but it just feels like they just want to get rid of everything from last year, right? Apart from the cornerstone pieces, right, on this team, right? The younger pieces also. It just feels like anybody that came in the last year or two, or even Davante just halfway through the season, they just kind of, it feels like they would rather just push everything else out and start from ground zero as much as possible. So it's important to remember that the Jets really went after Davante, like I said, halfway through the year. So the connection there with the organization is still relatively fresh, and now you bring in two new guys that essentially weren't there to bring Davante in. It doesn't really boost the chances of him staying anymore, right? Because they maybe didn't even want him there, right? If you really think about it. So it seems like there's going to be a lot more house cleaning, if you will, with New York, and getting all the stuff out of the organization that maybe don't fit into Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji's plans. But with that in mind, you know, with the speculation already starting pretty much with Davante and Aaron and what their futures are going to look like, ESPN reported recently about Davante Adams. It was actually Jeremy Fowler that pointed this out. In regards to Davante Adams' future, Jeremy Fowler said, "The Jets must address the future of receiver Davante Adams, whose 38.3 cap hit is untenable. A source told me Adams is intrigued by a return to the West Coast and would be open to potentially joining teams such as the Los Angeles Rams or the Los Angeles Chargers if he got released." And Jeremy Fowler also threw in there the 49ers because of the fact that Davante Adams grew up in North California. So from that report, from the sources connected to Jeremy Fowler, it seems like with a potential release in mind, I would say I feel like that would be the easiest way for the Jets to kind of move on from Davante Adams. It feels like all those teams out west, right? The teams that have already been linked with Davante even before this year, even going back to last offseason. I know we talked about the trade rumors and the sources and reports around Deebo Samuel and even, the Raiders. The trade talks with Davante going back to last offseason started pretty early, right? Even before training camp and stuff like that, right? I know Davante even came out and kind of gave a brief statement or answered the question about how committed he was to the Raiders. And, he gave that answer and he ended up getting traded away, obviously. But I know this was something that was still out there, even going back to last offseason. So now, with the history there and all the connections, I know all the California teams were part of this story, essentially, because of the roots there for Davante Adams and the connection to the 49ers, the Rams, and now the Chargers, right? Because they're also building something special there, it seems like. So, it's been something that Davante Adams has been linked to, even going back to his time when he was also leaving Green Bay, despite him being 32 years old now. You can tell he's still got a lot to give, right? And I think that's by no means like he's just washed or anything like that. I think he's been in two very challenging spots with Las Vegas and Derek, going there to obviously play with Derek, and then he gets shipped out right away, and now he goes over to play with Aaron, and he essentially is told by the organization that they want to move on from him. So the same thing happened to Davante in both times he decided to move. So now it just feels like instead of going back and playing with a former teammate or former quarterback, it seems like Davante has something else in mind, right? Talking about where he would potentially want to go, somewhere where he's comfortable, but also some teams that are very exciting to kind of speculate about when you're talking about the idea of adding a guy like Davante Adams, right? And in my opinion, I think the Rams would be the perfect fit for him, in my opinion, if I had to choose, right? It feels a lot like Odell Beckham Jr. going to the Rams. And I know Davante's not coming off of a major injury, and Davante's playing at a higher level than Odell was around the same age, or at least around the same age when he joined the Rams. So it does remind me of it, though, because just of the idea of a veteran, established household name at wide receiver coming into the Rams. And even better, like I just said with Davante, it feels like has a lot more to give still at this point than maybe Odell did at that time, getting over that injury and stuff like that. So Davante and the idea of him playing with Puka Nacua or Kyron Williams and a very exciting young defense and Matthew Stafford as well, being coached by Sean McVay, I think the Rams would be such an exciting opportunity for Davante Adams. And then you also have the fact that Cooper Kupp has been told that he is going to be traded, right? The Rams told him that they are going to be seeking a trade for him. So essentially Davante would slide right into that spot, and the Rams wouldn't really lose too much at all at that spot. And to some people, it might even be an upgrade. So I think the idea of him joining that team would be awesome, essentially because Matthew Stafford and Davante Adams' contract are also on similar timelines, right? I think Matthew has maybe a year or two left in him, max, because I think he's like 36 years old or something like that. And Davante Adams has 2 years left on his contract. So if you line it up and you get the most out of these next 2 years, right, you can essentially move on from Stafford if that's something that he wants to do. And also, Davante Adams would become a free agent at 34 years old. And if you don't want to sign him back and don't want to agree to maybe another large extension, then you don't have to do it also. So that's another reason why I feel like the timelines and the timing of everything feels almost too good to be true now for the Rams and Davante Adams. But it's not only the Rams, but also the Los Angeles Chargers, who wouldn't be a bad destination either, who I've been dying for them to get another wide receiver next to Ladd McConkey, and they're a little bit more more green, right? Because, Justin Herbert is younger. Jim Harbaugh just came back to the NFL. Their defense was playing at a very good level, and they're still kind of just getting established a little bit, right? With this new idea, this new regime coming in with Jim Harbaugh. So I still like the fit. I wouldn't mind the fit, but with the Rams, I feel like it's a little bit more like the stars are aligning, right? That sort of feeling with that situation with the Rams. But I wouldn't be upset about the Chargers either. I think they would love to have a guy in there like Davante Adams. Getting him with Justin Herbert would be a fantastic partnership, but that's only still speculation. And the other team is the 49ers, right? They stick out because there's always been those links of Davante going back and playing in San Francisco, and they're also moving on from Deebo Samuel, but it doesn't make sense to kind of move on from his contract, but also just take up Davante Adams, who's making similarly to what Deebo Samuel was and on a similar contract as well. It seems kind of counterintuitive there, especially because they got to extend Brock Purdy, and that seems to be on their mind, their goal at this point in time. So it seems exciting, and I think he would be great alongside Juwan Jennings and Brandon Ayuk and Ricky Pearsall. But with the finances and things that we're kind of seeing here with the 49ers, I don't know if it'll be a smooth transition, so to say. So, I mean, it's not only those teams, quite honestly. I mean, you got other teams like Denver, like the Steelers would probably stick out as well to a lot of teams. But to me, it's all about the Rams. I think it's all about them and the kind of scenario that they have. Very intriguing over there. They're only probably a couple of secondary pieces away, and maybe a linebacker from really having as close to a complete team as possible. All they'd have to do essentially is stay as healthy as possible for them to get into the playoffs. And if they improve their secondary and their off-ball linebackers, I think this team really has the makings to do something special sooner rather than later. So that would be my ideal fit. And we've talked about Deebo and we've talked about Cooper Kupp already a little bit, and I feel like Davante would probably be the first wide receiver of that group of three to find himself in a new scenario, just because you're talking about Deebo and Cooper Kupp. I feel like they're more likely, or both of them are actually going to be traded. So finding a trade partner and agreeing to a compromise, it seems a little bit more tricky than the Jets, as I expect them to release Davante Adams. So that's why I feel like Davante, also out of that group of him, Deebo, and Cooper Kupp, could probably find a new home relatively soon, right? Maybe in the next month and a half or something. Whereas the other ones, I feel like a trade is probably going to be pushed back a little bit later. So, Davante, it looks like he's going to go back out west. That would be the spot where I would probably bet on him to return to. I would find it really hard to believe if he stayed in New York. I don't think that's happening. So we'll see where he goes. It feels like it's going to be in the state of California. So it's going to be the Chargers, the Rams, or the 49ers, I would hope, and I would guess at this point in time. But for right now, we're still going to speculate. We're still going to talk about the initial portion of the offseason with more rumors and reports linking this time the Las Vegas Raiders to their potential new starting quarterback in 2025. Who would that be? Is it going to be a good fit? And, what does it mean for the landscape of the NFL? We're going to answer all of that and answer your speculations when we return right after this.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
We are quickly back here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast to continue our brief look into free agency a little bit and the rumors and speculation surrounding the Las Vegas Raiders now, right? The Raiders offseason will be one of the most important and attractive this year because they cleaned house essentially, right? They got rid of Antonio Pierce. They got rid of their general manager, who I can't think of his name right now, but they got rid of both of them. They got Tom Brady in there, a lot more involved in this rebuilding process. As a minority owner, he seems to be very hands-on. He's allowed to be hands-on with this whole process, so they got that going for them. They also got a lot of money to try and fix as many spots as possible this free agency, and they have one of the biggest questions to try and answer as well at the quarterback spot. So a lot of things to get to, a lot of objectives on their to-do list, but I think we can't move too far off of that quarterback spot, right? Because the Raiders simply can't go through another year with just these filling guys, these kind of just temporary options, these Band-Aid options right at the quarterback spot. No offense to Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell, but I feel like they need to truly find a guy now, right? Like a bunch of organizations that you just see having quarterbacks in a couple seasons, then they move on from them, obviously are nowhere near being a perennial consistent contender in the playoffs or in anything like that, right? You don't really have a lot of belief that they're always going to be there, right? Like they're going to give you a consistent performance if they can't even get the quarterback position right. So I think the Raiders have to try and find some sort of consistency and settle on somebody that they could hopefully have as their cornerstone for this organization going forward, right? And who better to help out with that than Tom Brady, right? The GOAT, obviously, of the NFL. What better person do you want to have evaluating quarterbacks and evaluating guys that you could potentially have in there as your face of the franchise, essentially? So that's obviously a great thing that they got going. And you don't have to look too hard, quite honestly, right? Because I know they have options in the draft, and I know they have other options in free agency, but free agency is the spot I wanted to work with because you don't got to look too far to find Sam Darnold at the top of everybody's wish list of potential quarterbacks that could become starters or continue to be starters in 2025, right? He's without a doubt the best free agent quarterback this year because of his 14 wins this past season and how historical that was, right? He had 14 wins, and that was the most in NFL history in the first season of any player, with their new team. So he had immediate impact, right? He contributed a lot to winning during the regular season, I will say, right? He just wasn't along for the ride. He made a couple of nice throws, and he managed himself very well, I thought, in the regular season. So he is, without a doubt, the quarterback that I think a lot of people will be trying to go after. And it was almost exactly a year ago from this recent report from ESPN that we heard around March time last year that the Vikings were interested in bringing Sam Darnold in, and look what a year brought us, right? How our mind and perception of Sam Darnold changed pretty drastically in just a year, and how things worked out for him this past season is kind of crazy to think about. But now a year ago from that, you have ESPN linking him to Las Vegas. ESPN's Adam Schefter said on the Super Bowl pregame show that he feels that the Raiders will have an interest in bringing Sam Darnold in while Minnesota still has options and they're still mulling over their options essentially at the quarterback spot. Adam Schefter believes, I'm sure because of stuff that he's hearing from a couple of sources, that the Raiders would certainly be interested in a guy like Sam Darnold. And that seems to me like an interesting fit for Sam Darnold, somewhere where not an interesting fit, but somewhere where I think would be an ideal fit for Sam Darnold if he isn't going to return to Minnesota, and they still got that franchise tag option if they want to do that. But I don't really feel they'll do something like that to Sam. I feel like, because Kevin O'Connell said something recently on the Pro Football Talk interview that he did during media week, right? He said how Sam Darnold has earned the right to become a free agent, right? So I don't feel like they're just going to say, you know what, we don't want you to go anywhere, so here, you're just going to stay with us one more year. We're putting the franchise tag on you, so that's pretty much going to be the end of the story, right? I feel like they got love for him. I feel like they hold him to a high esteem where if he wants to move on and, you know, he has another option that better for him financially, you know, long term, they're not just going to say like, you know what, we're just going to keep you. Sorry, you're just going to stay with us. I feel like they're very mature and they're doing well by Sam Darnold, right? I feel like they're going to do well by him. So the franchise tag is an option, but I don't really expect the Vikings to do something like that just based on what Kevin O'Connell had to say as well. So the feeling also for Minnesota is that they're leaning towards the idea of their former first-round rookie J.J. McCarthy to be potentially their starter this year. That seems to be the vibe over there, but I would still like for them to bring in a veteran quarterback somewhat to kind of be a bridge guy there still for JJ because he's coming back from a knee injury, so you can't just jump right to him and say, here, like, carry us to where Sam did, right? That's very unrealistic. So that seems to be the feeling from Minnesota, and it feels like Sam is probably going to be playing elsewhere in 2025. And I think it's also super fascinating how Sam Darnold is looked at so differently because, you know, this past season, I mentioned he had those 14 wins, but he was on such a high trajectory that those two losses to the Lions and then to the Rams, obviously, in the wild card round, those two losses could affect how people view him now so much just because of the team that he's on, right? Because before those last two games, he was on a high trajectory. Everybody was saying how he's going to play himself into a massive contract, a great contract for him, you know, good for Sam, good for him to put himself in this position. And you know what, like the Vikings should sign him to an extension. He's playing out of his mind. And then he loses those two games at the end and how everybody just kind of like stepped back a little bit. And now no one's that loud about Sam Darnold and being eager to bring him in because they saw those last two games, and now they're sort of hesitant around it. And I think it's interesting because you take that same context and you put it on a team like the Raiders, right? And they get a bunch of wins during the regular season and they make the playoffs and maybe they lose in the first round. But when it's looked at as such a disappointment in Minnesota, how that context is so different to a team like Las Vegas, where if they did the same thing, people would hold Sam and the Raiders to such a higher regard, right? And I think that level and changing of expectation, I think, is why the Raiders would be a good fit for Sam Darnold, right? With the Vikings, huge disappointment, right? Losing those two games, making the playoffs, but losing in the first round. Everybody is looking at Sam a little bit differently. But if he was with the Raiders and they did a similar sort of thing and they were kind of hanging around the playoffs and they earned themselves a wild card spot, people would be celebrating Sam Darnold, right? They'd be saying stuff like, oh, like, look how far he brought the Raiders, right? What a great job by Sam to orchestrate this offense and bring them to a spot where they probably beat teams out like the Bengals or the Steelers or the Texans or the Dolphins, right, to make the playoffs in a hypothetical scenario. Two very similar things, right, could change so much when you're talking about the context and the level of expectations. And I think it would be a good fit for Sam to be in a scenario like that, right, where he is in a team, in a context, in an environment where they're not expecting, I guess, a lot out of Sam, where he could just kind of play freely and not have to worry about competing with the best of the best. Not to say that Sam can't succeed with such great expectations like that, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't hold some sort of reservation around him after he did lose those two games, right? Like, I think that's important in a team like the Vikings and winning those moments and kind of shrinking, I say, in those moments. It had me looking at him a little bit differently, right? So if he were to go to Las Vegas with a lot less expectations and just kind of play freely, like I said, And after such great experiences with the 49ers and now this year with the Vikings, you're not going to get Sam playing like he did in New York, right, with the Raiders. I think the last couple of years have really taught him a lot and have been great learning experiences for him to bring to a new team. And if he's able to play similarly with everything that he's learned so far, I think he would be a great fit because you could say, oh, well, they should draft a rookie quarterback instead, right? I don't want to have Sam Darnold in there, right? But I don't know if there's enough certainty in that option, like I said, right? Which is what this organization really needs at this point in time, right? There's no guarantee that you get either Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders, right? If you're picking at number 6, and I definitely don't think they should trade up to get one of those guys. And let's say one of them does fall to you at 6, there's no guarantee that a rookie quarterback can come into the Raiders next season under these conditions and be anywhere near the level of like a Jaden or a CJ Stroud, right? That's not going to happen. So instead of doing that, why not sign a guy like Sam? I think would be the perfect fit, like I said, and build around him. You know, he's got the experience. He's been into some very bad situations like the Panthers and the Jets already. So he'd know how to deal with scenarios like that. He just came off of a very successful season, so he could lead these guys in that direction, everything he learned from last season, and build around him and really build some sort of foundation for this organization through free agency, through the draft. And then in a couple years maybe, after Sam Darnold or even during this Sam Darnold period with the Raiders potentially, then you could start thinking about bringing in a quarterback. But there's no way that I think that bringing in a quarterback now, it's going to turn the Raiders into something tremendously different than if they did have Sam as their quarterback. So I'm feeling like you sign Sam, you bring in a lot of pieces around him, you draft very well, and then in a year or two, you could really start looking for that certainty cornerstone at quarterback, right? And I think Sam, even if he's not a cornerstone, he's going to be a great option to have, a great improvement over the recent quarterbacks that they have had in that building. But that's still obviously a lot of speculation and things like that, but I thought it was interesting how there has been already these reports linking Sam Darnold and the Las Vegas Raiders, and I think it'd be a good fit. So we'll see where it goes once free agency gets going. But for us on this show, we got one more segment to get to, continuing our series, and don't you know it, we're going to talk about the Eagles on this episode. I think a fitting end to today's episode where we've talked about the Eagles a lot. Now we're already moving past the Super Bowl, and we're going to look to the offseason at some spots where I think the Eagles need improvements, with an air quotes on need, and look to see where they can get better in a month and a half or so. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with our last segment. Thank you for joining us here for our last segment on today's show. Just a continuation, another iteration of our series that we've had going on looking at upgrades and improvements for teams all around the NFL now that we're heading officially to free agency as the next big stop for the NFL, I should say. And I think it's pretty ironic how we're sitting here on a Tuesday, 2 days after the Super Bowl, and we're talking about the Eagles and where they need to get better, right? Like, they were the last team standing, and we're already discussing them on how they could already get better, right? And it's hard to say something like that because the Eagles have as good of a roster, like we talked about, as you would imagine in the NFL, and they already had the most talent on it, like I already said. But really, with free agency, it can get a little bit tricky because I know in the first segment how they do have some free agents and some potential spots that could move on in free agency if they don't, put as much attention to it as they need to, right? Free agency can sneak up on you a little bit, and before you know it, you got all these other teams swarming around you trying to steal some of your best players, especially if you don't sign them to, or if you don't come to an agreement beforehand once free agency starts. Then you got all these different teams throwing money at your guys and talking to them during the tampering period and stuff like that, and things can go sideways pretty quickly. So with the Eagles, their three major free agents that I think they need to bring back are definitely their linebacker, Zach Bond, their defensive lineman, Milton Williams, and their outside pass rusher, Josh Sweat. All of them, I think, are pivotal for the success of the Philadelphia Eagles and have all earned themselves a bigger contract, quite honestly, after their performances in the Super Bowl. And it's not MVP level Super Bowl performances, obviously, but Josh Sweat was a menace all night long. I'm pretty sure he got a sack or two at least in the Super Bowl over there matching up with Joe Thuney. Right next to him, you had Milton Williams, and they were tormenting Caliendo and Joe Thuney all night long. So both of those guys put on very, very good performances for themselves in the Super Bowl. And then Zach Bond, of course, how could I forget? Had an interception in the Super Bowl, and really all season for him has been all pro level from really start to finish. For a guy that's only on a 1-year deal, he's going to earn a lot more than that in free agency. And I'm sure the Eagles would hope that it is with them. I'm sure they're going to negotiate with Zach Bond first before anything else, because there's no way they let him just walk out that building. So with all of that in mind, that's really the main objective for the Eagles in free agency. But if one or two of those guys does get away, I think obviously D-line is where all of our attention has to go to for a spot that the Eagles need to have the most attention to during free agency as to where to look to, where to add to, and maybe just add some depth if it does come to the worst case scenario, right? You're not replacing anybody, you're just adding a lot more depth and options for yourself in free agency. So Zach Bond, like I mentioned before, is going to require a lot of money for the way that he played, and Williams and Josh Sweat could also be tricky, especially when you have multiple teams probably going to be interested in them. So the Eagles can't waste too much time here trying to negotiate with these free agents. But in case we do have some departures, you have a lot of options in free agency still. This is a good free agency group when you're talking about corners, especially. There's tons of good corners. And defensive line, I think we've talked almost every episode about teams that would need to upgrade their defensive line, and we've mentioned the same names over and over again, right? So for the Eagles, it's not going to be so different. You're looking at guys like Hassan Reddick would be a surprise, but he has been there, and I know he left because they couldn't agree to an extension, but after basically a year of not playing with the Jets, maybe he'd be open to returning to the Eagles on a lot less money. I'm sure the Eagles wanted to pay him less money, but he was reluctant to accept an extension with them, so they traded him away, and it didn't get any easier for the Jets. So now that he's a free agent, why would he scoff at the opportunity of joining the Super Bowl champions again, even if it was at less money? I think that would be something that he'd be open to, but I know they did leave off on some pretty cold terms. So that one's kind of a shot in the dark, but I wouldn't be surprised, quite honestly. Then you got guys maybe like a Chase Young. If Josh Sweat is to move on, bringing in a guy like Chase Young, who's been going from contract to contract recently. I think he's still very much in a prove-it sort of scenario. So with that, he could still sign a 1 to 2 year deal, prove himself with the Philadelphia Eagles, and if he balls out and starts alongside like guys like Nolan Smith on the other side, say, and he plays out of his mind, then he can earn himself another contract. But for right now, I think he could be on a 1 to 2 year basis where the Eagles could look at him as a very intriguing option, right? We're talking about a guy that was selected as the top pick in the NFL draft, right? If I'm not mistaken. So, he's obviously very talented, and he could be an option for the Eagles. Also, I mean, worst case scenario, if Zach Bond leaves, you could look at guys like Dre Greenlaw, Ernest Jones, the fourth potentially from Seattle, could be a cheaper option. Also, along the defensive line, you got guys like Poona Ford or DJ Jones as well, if a guy like Milton Williams signs for a lot of money somewhere else as well. So, a lot of options in free agency, but also in the draft, because they're picking so late, maybe they're not going to get a guy like Nolan or Walter Nolan or something like that, or Kenneth Grant, or, none of those like early portion of the first round kind of guys. I think those two guys specifically might be out of their range by the time 32 comes along. So in the draft, I'm sure they're going to be looking at guys like Jack Sawyer, would be an interesting one, as just a very team-oriented, group-first, team-first mentality sort of guy. Very much earning his way to playing time and being all about the team, I would say. I think he would be a great fit in Philadelphia, and, he's obviously a great player as well. Someone like Tyleik Williams also would be an interesting option from Ohio State for the Eagles. Also, not going too far off of defensive line, you look at a guy like Darius Alexander, who had a very good Senior Bowl a couple weeks ago now from Toledo. He seems to be a guy that's rising on a lot of teams' draft boards because he played very well in the first sort of action in front of NFL coaches. So he would be a monster in Philadelphia, I would imagine. TJ Sanders as well is another guy they could look at in the later portion, early portion of the second round. So, or late portion, I would say, in both scenarios, right? It doesn't flip. But yeah, those are all the options I think that are on the table for the Eagles. Again, I want to stress that re-signing Zach Bond, Milton Williams, and Josh Sweat would be an ideal scenario for the Eagles. And then from that point on, I know there's been some trade talks about Myles Garrett and things like that. I don't think that would be something that would be possible. Like, it better not be. Like, if Myles Garrett joins the Eagles, like, that would just be so just absurdly dumb and just ridiculous that it shouldn't happen. Like, the NFL should void that trade like the NBA did with that Chris Paul trade. So I don't think that would ever happen, but you can't never say never, to be quite honest with you. So I feel like them looking at other options like a Chase Young, like a Poona Ford, like a Ernest Jones the fourth, and then drafting guys in the later portion of the draft would be a spot where they would feel most at home in adding depth and a lot of variety with this defensive line. Because other than that, I mean, I don't know what the future is for a guy like Darius Slay, right? He's one of the veterans that they have. I don't know if he moves on, you're obviously going to need to look at your options there. But like I said, corner's a very deep group in free agency, but also in the draft as well. So they're not going to have any trouble getting some depth there. And also, I mean, you got guys like a guy like Brandon Graham potentially retiring. So that's another one where he might not be there for you next season. And a guy like Bryce Huff also has been pretty disappointing so far after signing to the Eagles from the New York Jets. And he really hasn't contributed that much. So he really doesn't provide so much to this team right now. So adding depth and pieces that you could really trust going forward would be huge for this team, especially the way that they play. Everybody says they play super simple, right? Because they just rush 4 and cover with 7, but they do a fantastic job of it. So making sure they're able to have the guys in place to continue to play like that is going to be one of their major goals for this offseason. But, again, it's pretty ironic that we're talking about them now trying to get better after just winning and proving that they were better than everybody else just a couple days ago. So we'll see where the Eagles go. I'm sure Howie Roseman has something up his sleeve, as he always does, so that's going to be exciting to watch. But for us right now, we are going to sign off for today's episode. I want to thank you guys for joining me on today's show of the Chip Shot Football Podcast. And please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show, as well as checking out more content around the Chip Shot Football Podcast on YouTube at the GSMC Podcast Network channel and the GSMC Sports Network channel, where you can see more of the NFL coverage with me, Manny Maradiaga, as your host, looking at more stories around free agency, more stories on the draft coming up, obviously, right? And just a lot of news around the offseason and talking all things NFL, basically. Again, each and every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So make sure to join me next time on the episode of the Chip Shot Football Podcast.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna